Borzou, I want to start with you because you're stationed in the Middle East, and the theme of this conversation is authoritarianism and resistance. And I've always wondered about, although you're stationed in Beirut, but many times you're covering countries that you're not there. Yet at the same time, sometimes you're there, while events are happening. And I just was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about the dilemmas, the positions, the considerations you have when you're reporting from inside as well as outside. What are the limitations? What are the possibilities? What are the challenges?
Well, I mean, generally, like other bigger news organizations, and there are fewer and fewer now that do international coverage, but the Los Angeles Times continues to do so. Generally, we have correspondents scattered around the world, and these are full-time employees of the newspaper, but we also sometimes rely on stringers, local correspondents of various stature in terms of sometimes they're occasional freelancers who are contributing a feed, as we call it, or writing a story, or they are permanent people who are on a retainer or some sort of salary. And oftentimes, especially in a situation, for example, like Tunisia, or Iran or Libya, for example. These are places that it's very hard for people to get visas to. So if you have a news event in a country, let's say Tunisia or Algeria, for example. Algeria is a very good example, actually, where we have not been able to get a visa for Algeria in years. So we're very much dependent on local stringers who help us get access to the information there, and that has its limitations, of course. It's still having someone in the region is still an advantage. Having me, for example, in Beirut, working with someone in Algeria, at least I know the area, I know the region. We're in a similar time zone, which is a big issue. Your office is in New York. The editors aren't even in yet at the time when most news happens in that part of the world. So to have even someone in the same time zone able to make a few phone calls, because by the time people in New York or LA get to work, offices are closed.
Yeah,
people,
exactly.
and you know how it is in the Middle East as well. People, they go home at 2. It's over after lunch. People don't stick around until 6 in the evening. So
The same with Friday and Sunday and Saturday here.
exactly, yeah.
Weekends.
So it's like basically you have to get started on it at that time. So, but it's very tough in that sense. Let me ask you a question. How do you do right now? Because it's hard for us, and we really, as journalists, we depend on analysts. We cannot oftentimes write context with any authority or with a lot of authority. Sometimes you can. I feel like I can, but I'm covering an opaque place such as Libya. I need to talk to an expert. How does someone get reliable information from a place like Iran, for example?
Well, it's very difficult, and I think there are similar dilemmas because I sit in Honolulu, which is completely, in terms of time zone, the opposite of Iran. And I wake up in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, the day is already over in Iran, and I'm trying to figure out what's happening. So I have, while at the same time, as an academic and as a researcher of Iran, I do have a background in Iran, and I understand, at least I have a story for myself in terms of politics in Iran. Yet you're dealing with a very fluid situation. Politics in a country is never static, it's constantly changing. I have not been able to go back to Iran since 2006. When I went there to do a report for the International Crisis Group, and by chance, bad luck, got arrested, and therefore, and things have evolved since then that has made it very difficult for academics who used to go back to Iran to go back. So I am faced with a situation where I have to rely, in a sense, on a reserve that I have because I spent so much time in Iran, a whole decade of 1990s and early 2000s, which gave me a feel of the place, and I was able to connect to a whole lot of people, and therefore have and be, in a sense, one of the few people that has gone back to Iran, Islamic Iran, and has spent quite a bit of time there. So in trying to make sense of current situations, I have to rely on that reserve that I have. But it's very clear to me that the more time passes by, I am losing a lot in the process because the situation is very dynamic. And the way I try to respond to that change situation is by becoming a lot more humble, in a sense, in trying to deal with issues that are narrower and I have access to. So, for example, I obviously read the language, so I make a point to read all the newspapers. In fact, that's why I wake up 5 o'clock in the morning to go through every single newspaper that comes from different, obviously, ideological backgrounds and try to understand it within the context that I have. But it's very difficult because there are two issues involved here. One is the issue of data. How do I get information about Iran, correct information? I mean, look what just happened in Iran. There was a demonstration in Iran yesterday, and we have reports coming from Iran that say there were, a few hundred people, and there were reports that say there were hundreds of thousands of people. And this is, these are legitimate reporting from, so, I mean, people who are considered to be reliable. So how do I make sense of this situation coming from the outside? So obviously, I cannot make a sense of that situation sitting from Hawaii. However, I can make a sense of the debates that are going on among various ideological groups in Iran. So I try to focus on the conversation, for example, or the conflicts, the institutional conflicts between the parliament and the presidency. But you can already see how the range of my analysis is narrowing because I'm unable to find real data. Then there is the question of narrative, whether or not the reserve that I have, the narrative that I developed, the understanding that I developed in Iran during the years that I spent there is still a valid narrative or not, or the dynamic has changed so much. And that's also very difficult to do. But, you try to be persistent, you try to be consistent, and you try to be fair in the sense that you cannot rely on just one side of the story. You try to cover the whole arena.